What would you do if, after decades of marriage, a shocking secret came to light that changed everything you thought you knew about your spouse? This is a story of love, betrayal, and a discovery so unbelievable it left everyone speechless. Stay with us, because this tale takes a turn no one could have predicted. Barbara and Richard Thompson were the kind of couple you read about in romance novels. After 40 years of marriage, they seemed to embody the ideal partnership. Their days were filled with the quiet joys of retirement, long walks along the beach, gardening in their sunlit backyard, and weekly bridge games with friends. Barbara, a retired schoolteacher, had an air of warmth that made everyone feel at home. Richard, a former accountant, was meticulous and thoughtful, always making sure things ran smoothly. They had 2 grown children and a grandchild on the way, and their family adored them. But beneath the surface of their idyllic life, cracks were beginning to form. It started with Richard's restlessness. Barbara noticed he had begun spending more time away from home. Early morning jogs that stretched into hours, frequent trips to the library, even though he never brought back a book. When she asked about it, he'd brush her off with a reassuring smile. "I'm just trying to stay active," he'd say. Barbara wanted to believe him. After all, they had built a life based on trust. But something felt off. And it wasn't just Richard. Barbara found herself growing distant, too. She had joined a local painting class, a hobby she had always dreamed of pursuing, and it introduced her to a world outside their shared routine. One day, Barbara noticed Richard's phone buzzing on the counter while he was in the shower. A name she didn't recognize appeared. Amanda. Her stomach tightened, but she told herself she was being paranoid. Unbeknownst to Richard, Barbara had her own reasons for feeling guilty. During her painting class, she had grown close to a man named Paul. Paul was charismatic, funny, and endlessly complimentary, qualities Barbara hadn't felt from Richard in years. It started innocently enough. Paul would linger after class to discuss her work, offering pointers and encouraging her creativity. But as weeks passed, their conversations became more personal. They'd meet for coffee after class, and Barbara began to feel a spark she hadn't experienced since her early years with Richard. One rainy afternoon, Barbara and Paul found themselves alone in the small cafe they frequented. The conversation turned to their personal lives, and Barbara confessed the growing distance she felt with Richard. "Maybe it's just a phase," Paul suggested, his voice gentle. "Maybe," Barbara replied, though she wasn't convinced. She felt a pang of guilt, but she couldn't deny the connection she felt with Paul. At the same time, Richard's behavior became more secretive. He started locking his phone, leaving the house without explanation, and making excuses for canceled plans. Barbara's suspicions grew, but she didn't confront him. Instead, she chose to focus on her budding friendship with Paul, rationalizing that it was harmless. Both Barbara and Richard were walking a dangerous line, each unaware of the other's secret. The turning point came on a Saturday morning. Barbara was tidying the bedroom when she found a receipt tucked into the pocket of Richard's jacket. It was from a high-end restaurant in the next town over, a place they had never visited together. Her heart raced as she pieced together the clues: the locked phone, the extended absences, the name Amanda. Richard was having an affair. She was sure of it. But instead of confronting him, Barbara decided to investigate. She called her best friend, Linda, and the two hatched a plan to follow Richard the next time he left the house unexpectedly. The following week, Barbara tailed Richard to a boutique hotel. From the safety of her parked car, she watched as Richard greeted a stylish woman with a warm hug. Her chest tightened as they disappeared inside. Heartbroken and furious, Barbara drove home, her mind racing with questions. How long had this been going on? Who was this woman? Had their entire marriage been a lie? That evening, she didn't say a word to Richard about what she had seen. Instead, she sent a text to Paul. "I need to talk." As Barbara wrestled with her emotions, Richard had his own secret struggles. The truth about Amanda was far more complicated than it appeared. And Barbara's decision to meet Paul would set off a chain of events that would unravel the very foundation of their marriage. Barbara met Paul the next day at their usual cafe. The rain outside mirrored the storm brewing in her heart. As Paul walked in, his warm smile momentarily eased her tension, but it didn't last long. "Paul?" Barbara began, her voice trembling. "I think Richard is having an affair." Paul leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure?" Barbara recounted everything: the distant behavior, the locked phone, the mysterious receipts, and her trip to the hotel. Her hands shook as she spoke, the words spilling out in a mix of anger and sorrow. Paul listened intently, his expression softening. "I'm so sorry, Barbara. You don't deserve this." His words felt like a balm to her wounded heart. For a moment, Barbara let herself imagine a life where she didn't have to fight for someone's attention. A life where she felt truly seen. Meanwhile, Richard was meeting Amanda at the same boutique hotel Barbara had seen. As they sat in the cozy lounge, Amanda handed Richard a folder filled with old photographs, documents, and letters. "You need to tell her," Amanda said firmly, her voice tinged with frustration. Richard shook his head, running a hand through his graying hair. "I can't. Not yet." "Richard, this isn't just about you. Barbara has a right to know." Amanda's tone softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. "She's going to find out eventually? Wouldn't you rather it come from you?" Richard sighed heavily, staring at the folder. The weight of the secret he had carried for decades was crushing him. "You're right. I'll tell her. Soon." That evening, Barbara couldn't hold back any longer. As they sat down for dinner, the tension in the room was palpable. Finally, she set down her fork and looked Richard square in the eye. "Who's Amanda?" Richard froze, his hand hovering over his glass of wine. He composed himself quickly, but Barbara caught the flicker of panic in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" he asked, feigning ignorance. "I followed you," Barbara said, her voice firm. "I saw you meet her at the hotel. Don't lie to me, Richard." Richard's shoulders sagged, and he set down his glass. For a moment, he looked like he might deny it, but then he sighed deeply. "It's not what you think." "Then explain it," Barbara snapped, "because right now it looks like my husband of 40 years is cheating on me." Richard stood and walked to the living room, gesturing for Barbara to follow. He retrieved the same folder Amanda had given him earlier that day and handed it to her. "This is what I've been hiding." Barbara opened the folder, her anger quickly giving way to confusion as she sifted through the contents. The photographs were old, black and white snapshots of a young woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to Amanda. There were handwritten letters, birth certificates, and medical records. "Who is this?" Barbara asked, her voice trembling. Richard hesitated before answering. "Amanda is my daughter, from before we met." Barbara's heart stopped. "What?" "I was young, reckless," Richard began, his voice heavy with regret. "Her mother and I had a brief relationship. I didn't even know Amanda existed until a few months ago, when she reached out to me. She wanted to meet me, to understand where she came from." Barbara stared at him, her mind racing. "You've been sneaking around to spend time with her? Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know how," Richard admitted. "I was afraid of how you'd react, afraid of what it would mean for us. I didn't want to disrupt our lives." Barbara sat down heavily on the couch, the folder clutched in her hands. "You didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. Instead, you let me believe you were having an affair." "I'm sorry," Richard said, sitting beside her. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Barbara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It's not just about the secret, Richard. It's about how distant we've become. We've been living separate lives for years." Richard reached for her hand, but Barbara pulled away. "I need time to process this." That night, Barbara couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring out at the rain-soaked street. The revelation about Amanda was shocking, but it wasn't the root of her pain. The real issue was the emotional distance that had grown between her and Richard, a chasm that neither of them had acknowledged until now. Her thoughts drifted to Paul. He had been a source of comfort, a reminder of what it felt like to be appreciated. But was she ready to walk away from a lifetime with Richard for the possibility of something new? The next day, Barbara decided to meet Amanda. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe, where Barbara found herself face to face with the woman she had assumed was Richard's mistress. Amanda was warm and articulate, her nervousness mirroring Barbara's own. "I didn't mean to cause trouble between you and Richard," Amanda began. "I just wanted to know my father." Barbara studied her, seeing traces of Richard in her features. "Why didn't you reach out sooner?" Amanda hesitated. "I didn't know about him until my mother passed away, and I found some old letters. When I finally contacted him, I didn't expect him to want a relationship. But he did." Barbara nodded slowly, her anger softening. Amanda wasn't the enemy. She was another piece of Richard's past, one that he hadn't been brave enough to share. As Barbara left the cafe, she felt a mix of emotions: confusion, anger, and a strange sense of empathy. The truth about Amanda had changed everything, but it hadn't answered the bigger question. Could she and Richard find their way back to each other, or had the damage already been done? And as she drove home, Barbara couldn't help but wonder, was she ready to fight for her marriage? Or was it time to start a new chapter of her own? Barbara returned home from her meeting with Amanda, her mind swirling with emotions. For years, she had believed she and Richard shared a life without secrets. Now, she faced the reality that their marriage wasn't as unblemished as she had thought. Richard was in the living room when she walked in, his face etched with worry. He stood as she entered, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Did you meet her?" "I did," Barbara replied, setting down her purse. "She's lovely, and she's your daughter. I see that now." Richard exhaled in relief, but Barbara's next words hit him like a blow. "But that doesn't erase what you've done." "Barbara, I know I've hurt you," he said, stepping closer. "But we can fix this. I want to fix this." Barbara shook her head. "You've been hiding from me, Richard. Not just Amanda, but everything. When was the last time we were truly honest with each other? You didn't trust me with the truth, and I didn't trust you enough to confront you. That's not a marriage, that's just coexisting." In the days that followed, Barbara found herself leaning on Paul more than she intended. They met for coffee again, and as they sat across from each other, Paul's concern was evident. "You've been through a lot," Paul said gently. "It's no wonder you feel lost." "I just don't know if I can trust Richard again," Barbara admitted. "It's not just Amanda. It's the years of distance, the way we've drifted apart." Paul reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "You deserve to feel loved and appreciated, Barbara. If Richard can't give you that, maybe it's time to think about what you want, what makes you happy." Her heart ached at his words, not because they weren't true, but because they were. For the first time in decades, Barbara considered the possibility of life without Richard. Meanwhile, Richard was grappling with his own guilt. Amanda had encouraged him to fight for his marriage, and he took her advice to heart. He began making small gestures, cooking dinner, leaving notes for Barbara, and trying to engage her in meaningful conversations. One evening, he found Barbara in the garden tending to her roses. "Do you remember when we planted these?" he asked, crouching beside her. Barbara glanced at him, her expression guarded. "It was after our first big fight. You said they'd be a symbol of fresh starts." Richard nodded, his voice soft. "I want a fresh start, Barbara. With you." Her hands paused over the soil. "Fresh starts only work if both people are willing to put in the effort." "Are you?" "Yes," Richard said firmly. "But I need to know if you are too." A week later, Amanda invited both Barbara and Richard to her home for dinner. She wanted to introduce them to her family, her husband, Michael, and their 2 young children. Barbara hesitated, unsure if she was ready to face the new reality of Richard's extended family, but she agreed, realizing that meeting Amanda's family could help her decide what she wanted for her own future. At dinner, Barbara was struck by Amanda's warmth and her children's joyful energy. Watching Richard interact with his grandchildren brought an unexpected pang of emotion. He was so natural, so attentive, a side of him she hadn't seen in years. Michael raised a toast during dessert. "To new beginnings," he said, smiling at Amanda and Richard. Barbara clinked her glass with the others, but inside, she felt torn. Was this a new beginning for her and Richard, or the end of their chapter? That night, Barbara sat in her bedroom, staring at the framed photos on the dresser, snapshots of her life with Richard. Their wedding day, family vacations, the birth of their children. Each photo told a story of love, resilience, and shared history. But was history enough? The next morning, she met Richard at the kitchen table. He looked up, his eyes heavy with worry. "Have you made a decision?" Barbara took a deep breath. "Yes. I need space, Richard. I need time to figure out what I want, who I am outside of this marriage." Richard's face fell, but he nodded. "If that's what you need, I'll respect it. But I hope you'll find your way back to me." In the weeks that followed, Barbara began exploring life on her own. She took art classes, traveled with friends, and even attended a retreat for women rediscovering themselves after major life changes. She found joy in small moments, walking through a museum, trying new recipes, and connecting with old friends. Paul remained a supportive presence, but Barbara kept their relationship platonic. She wasn't ready to jump into anything new, especially while still untangling her feelings for Richard. While Barbara focused on herself, Richard began making changes of his own. He volunteered at a local community center and started therapy to confront the fears and insecurities that had led him to hide Amanda from Barbara. He also worked on rebuilding his relationship with Amanda, forming a bond that was both healing and redemptive. One evening, Barbara returned home to find a letter from Richard on the kitchen table. It wasn't a plea for her to return. It was a heartfelt reflection on their life together, their challenges, and his hopes for the future. "I want you to be happy, Barbara," the letter concluded. "Whether that's with me or not, I just want you to know that I'll always cherish what we had." Tears filled Barbara's eyes as she read the letter. For the first time, she saw Richard not as the man who had disappointed her, but as someone who was genuinely trying to change. As she folded the letter, she knew her journey wasn't over, but she also knew she had a choice to make, a choice that would define the rest of her life. Barbara sat on her porch, holding Richard's letter in her hands. The evening sun bathed the garden in a golden glow, the same garden they had built together over decades of marriage. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to reflect on the good moments, the laughter, the shared dreams, and the life they had built. She realized something. While their marriage had been fractured by secrets and distance, it wasn't entirely broken. The question was whether she wanted to try to mend it. A week after receiving the letter, Barbara invited Richard to meet her at their favorite park. It was a place they had visited often when their children were young, a space filled with memories. Richard arrived, looking nervous but hopeful. He carried a small bouquet of daisies, Barbara's favorite. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as he handed them to her. Barbara smiled softly. "I needed some time to think, and I wanted to talk." They sat on a bench overlooking the lake, the gentle ripples mirroring the ebb and flow of their conversation. Barbara spoke first. "I've been angry, Richard. Hurt. But I also know that we've both made mistakes. I wasn't always present either. I let us drift apart." Richard nodded, his expression earnest. "I take responsibility for my part in that. I should have been honest with you about Amanda from the start. I let my fear get in the way." Barbara sighed. "What I need to know now is whether we can move forward. Not as the people we were, but as who we are now." Richard hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I want to try, but only if you do. I don't want to pressure you, Barbara. I just want you to be happy." They agreed to take things slow, starting with weekly dinners at home. Barbara insisted on honesty, and Richard promised to be transparent about his thoughts and feelings. It was awkward at first, like learning how to communicate all over again, but gradually the barriers between them began to fall. One evening, Richard surprised Barbara by taking her to a painting class. "I know how much this means to you," he said with a shy smile. "I thought it might be something we could share." Barbara was touched by the gesture. During the class, they laughed at their clumsy attempts to recreate the instructor's design, rediscovering a lightheartedness they hadn't felt in years. Amanda also became an unexpected bridge in their healing process. She invited Barbara and Richard to family dinners, where Barbara observed a side of Richard she hadn't seen in a long time, a patient, attentive father figure. One evening, as they helped Amanda clean up after dinner, Amanda pulled Barbara aside. "I hope you know how much he loves you," she said. "He talks about you all the time. He's trying, Barbara. He really is." Barbara smiled, her heart softening. "I can see that, and I appreciate it." As Barbara and Richard began to reconnect, Barbara knew she needed to close the chapter with Paul. She met him at the cafe where they had shared so many conversations, her heart heavy but resolute. "Paul," she began, "I owe you so much. You were there for me when I felt lost, and I'll always be grateful for that." Paul's expression softened, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "But you're choosing Richard?" Barbara nodded. "We've shared a life together, and I feel like we owe it to ourselves to try to rebuild what we had. I hope you understand." Paul smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his voice. "I do. And I wish you all the happiness in the world, Barbara. You deserve it." They parted on good terms, and while Barbara felt a pang of sadness, she also felt a sense of closure. On their 41st wedding anniversary, Richard surprised Barbara with a dinner in the garden they had planted together. Fairy lights hung from the trees, and the table was set with their favorite dishes. As they ate, Richard took Barbara's hand. "I know we can't go back to the way things were," he said, "but I want to build something new with you, something stronger, something real. Will you give me that chance?" Barbara felt tears well up in her eyes. "I want that too," she said softly. "But we have to promise to keep communicating, to be honest with each other, no matter what." Richard nodded, his grip on her hand tightening. "I promise." The next day, Barbara and Richard began making plans, not just for themselves, but for their family. They hosted a barbecue for Amanda, her family, and their other children, bringing everyone together for the first time. Barbara watched as Richard played with his grandchildren, laughter echoing through the yard. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. Their marriage wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was real. And as Barbara stood beside Richard, she realized that was enough. Just as Barbara and Richard thought they had reached a new equilibrium, a letter arrived in the mail. It was addressed to both of them, written in a shaky hand. The return address was from someone neither of them had seen in decades, Richard's first love, Amanda's mother. "Dear Barbara and Richard," the letter began, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Barbara's heart skipped a beat as she read the words. What could possibly be left to uncover? Barbara sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling in her hands. Richard stood behind her, his brow furrowed in confusion and concern. "What does it say?" he asked, his voice low. Barbara hesitated, her eyes scanning the words again. "It's from Amanda's mother," she said softly. "She says there's something we need to know about the past." Richard's face paled. What could she possibly mean? Barbara handed him the letter, her heart pounding as he began to read. The letter explained that Amanda's mother, Margaret, had discovered a long-hidden truth about Amanda's parentage. While she had believed Richard was Amanda's father, recent health issues had led to genetic testing. The results revealed that Amanda's biological father was someone else entirely. A man Margaret had dated briefly before meeting Richard. "I should have told you years ago," the letter read. "But I was scared, and you were so kind, Richard. You stepped up without hesitation. I let you believe Amanda was yours because I thought it was best for her. Now, I see that wasn't fair to either of you. I hope you can forgive me." Richard set the letter down, his hands shaking. "She's not my daughter," he whispered. Barbara reached for his hand, her heart aching at the pain in his voice. "Richard, this doesn't change what you've built with Amanda. She's still your family." Richard nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mix of grief and confusion. "I've loved her as my own from the moment I met her. That doesn't change. But I don't know how to tell her this." The following day, Barbara and Richard invited Amanda over to their home. They sat together in the living room, the tension thick in the air. Richard held the letter, his knuckles white as he gripped it. "Amanda," he began, his voice trembling, "there's something we need to talk about. It's about your mother and me." Amanda's brow furrowed. "What's going on?" Richard handed her the letter, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Amanda read it in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. When she finished, she looked up, her voice trembling. "You're saying, you're not my father?" Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "I didn't know, Amanda. I thought I was, and I still feel like I am, no matter what that letter says." Tears streamed down Amanda's face, but she reached out to take Richard's hand. "You've always been my dad. This doesn't change that." Barbara watched the exchange, her own emotions swirling. She felt a deep respect for Amanda's grace and Richard's unwavering love. In the weeks that followed, Amanda reached out to Margaret's family to learn more about her biological father. She discovered he had passed away years earlier, but she connected with some of his relatives, finding comfort in understanding more about her roots. Barbara and Richard supported her through the journey, attending family gatherings and encouraging her to embrace this new part of her identity. The revelation, while shocking, brought Barbara and Richard closer together. They found themselves leaning on each other more than ever, their shared love for Amanda uniting them in unexpected ways. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Richard took Barbara's hand. "I don't know what I would have done without you through all of this." Barbara smiled, her eyes glistening. "We've been through a lot, Richard, but we're stronger for it." The experience inspired Barbara to start a support group for families navigating unexpected revelations and complex relationships. Richard joined her, sharing his story and helping others find strength in their own journeys. The group became a cornerstone of their community, and Barbara and Richard found a renewed sense of purpose in helping others. On Amanda's birthday, Barbara and Richard hosted a celebration at their home. The garden was alive with laughter and music. Their family and friends gathered to honor the woman who had brought so much love into their lives. As Barbara watched Amanda blow out the candles on her cake, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Their family wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Barbara wrote in her journal late that night, reflecting on the journey she and Richard had taken. "Life is unpredictable, messy, and sometimes heartbreaking. But it's also beautiful, full of second chances and unexpected blessings. Through it all, love, true, enduring love, is what carries us forward." She closed the journal and looked over at Richard, who was already asleep, his hand resting on hers. For the first time in a long time, Barbara felt truly at peace. What would you do if your family's deepest secrets were revealed? Would it bring you closer or tear you apart? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of resilience, redemption, and the power of love.